Good
Hello.
morning.
Good morning.
Wait, Sonia, you there too? Did you say something?
I think we all said good morning to everyone.
5, 4, 3, 2. Good morning. Okay.
Yes, good morning.
Hi. Um, well, okay. Welcome, everybody. Is this thing on? Is this thing on? It's nice to see folks, sort of, see you.
Yeah.
Um,
See your name.
Today is another special day with Bridget Sumser, our favorite social worker, among other things. But we'll cut to Bridget in a second. Few little housekeeping things, folks. If this is your first time to one of our webinars, welcome. The gist of these things is pretty simple. This is a safe space to think, feel just about anything. Boundaries are simply sort of respect and kindness, including for yourself, please. And otherwise, sort of, anything kind of goes in here. The way it'll work is Bridget and I will work through, well, today's a little different, but we'll probably hit some slides. But the most of the action is really in conversation with you guys. So questions or comments or whatever are all very, very welcome. You don't have to speak up. There's no pressure here, but please, you're certainly welcome to. So today, just real quick, we're going to be picking up on our conversation last month around relationships, obviously a mega subject. So we'll sort of pick up where we left off the last time. We were very broad based, kind of went all over the place because the subject is ginormo. And today, Bridget and I will try to bring it down to a little bit more sort of specific, personal, individual around the relation, the caregiving dynamic, and the compassion for each other, basics of sort of getting to the meat of a one-on-one dynamic. But we'll also go other places too. Bridge, I'm dying to let you talk, but before we do that, let's cut over to Lady Sonia real quick for some housekeeping stuff.
Thank you, BJ. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So as BJ mentioned, he and Bridget are going to cover some topics, and then the best part is getting to speak with all of you, and you can do that in two ways. You can click the raise hand button, and we'll unmute you, and you can speak with Bridget and BJ. And if you'd prefer to not do that, you can type it into the Q&A section, and I will read it aloud for you. The chat is also open, so if anything comes up that you want to comment on, please feel free to put it in there. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Sones. Okay, Bridge. I'll one more thing and then I'll shut up. I just want to say for folks,
this is just the beginning.
What's that?
Oh, it's just the beginning. You're not anywhere close to being quiet.
You're right. That was a lie.
Yeah.
Was a lie. But yes, before I shut up this particular moment, I just want to say, because these things are related to our practice at Mettle Health, but also not. They're not limited to anything that we do at Mettle with clients per se. But I'll just point out this subject. I mean, our model of care, if that's the right way of putting it, is a relationship-centric model of care. That is, and that's language, at least I first heard from Rachel Remen, versus disease-focused care or patient-centered care even. It's sort of more put the focus on the dynamic between people. That's the way of including everybody. So just a little more preamble. But with that, Gidge, what do you think? Where do you want to go?
Well, I'm just noticing that, we have 14 people here today, which is smaller, I feel like. And so it really is an invitation. If you came with something on your mind, on your heart, we would love to hear from you and have this conversation really be co-directed and co-inspired by you. So even now, please feel free to raise a hand, throw something into the chart. So into the chat. So we can, be speaking to what brought you here today.
Right. And amen. And especially if there are any lingering questions or comments from the last time. And we don't need to. There's continuity here, but we can also start fresh. So any hands up? I can't see from my screen.
Not so far. Oh, here we go. We got a little comment.
Can you say something about your main theme for the day?
There we go.
Yeah, we're here to talk about relationships and how relationships are impacted in the setting of serious illness. And so that's really big and broad. I think just to build on what BJ was saying about our practice at Mettle Health and sort of our orientation to how we think about this is that kind of like everything comes out of relationship. And so much possibility, there's so much possibility for healing, for connection, for growth and evolution, for frustration, right? For all of the things in the ways in which we connect and relate to one another. I think
both sides of that. I mean, the caregiver, the care receiver, it is right.
Right, professional and personal, right? I think that's something we hold so close in our practice, which is while we may be, quote, professional helpers or the professional on the side of the relationship, right? It's very much about a give and take on both sides, a give and receive on both sides.
Hey, Bridget, I got another little clarifying question from Rita, who is wondering if this is going to cover relationships among people or among anything. We just covered this in our pre-discuss.
Yeah, totally. I think we're going to focus more on relationships between people today, and try and get really specific and talk some specifics about the ways in which serious illness changes how we understand one another. And what do we do about that, right? Because it can feel so challenging.
Yep. And on that note, I'd say I'd add sort of another piece of color there is like, how do you, especially in this frame of serious illness, there's so much to be done. There's just can be so much going on, and if not physically, then emotionally and psychologically. And another way of another way into thinking about what we're trying to head here is, how do you be in this caring dynamic without losing yourself, especially as a caregiver, but in both directions, or sort of how a lot of us, I'll speak for myself, I can find it, I can kind of be there for myself and I can kind of be there for others, but blending the two gets really beautiful and amazing and also really confusing. And sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself on behalf of another. I mean, it just gets really wild how to really show up for everything that's going on, including in you, whether you're the patient or the caregiver. Is another way of holding what we're trying to do today, I think.
Yeah, I think we talked about this slide last time, but I actually think it's a good place to start, because serious illness can kind of make this fact that relationships are always changing, like kind of on blast. Like it really amplifies the sense of like, my capacity is changing, my ability is changing, the flow of my daily life is changing, and often very starkly. And it creates interpersonal challenge because we have to really rapidly learn and track how our relating is evolving and changing. And it can feel so sticky because this is generally a situation that we don't want, that we haven't chosen, that we have grief about, that we have anger about. And then we're having to make all of these adaptations every day. And then we look at our spouse or we look at our best friend and we don't know how to relate to them in a way that feels comfortable. And there's so much, kind of can add the layers of frustration or anger or pain. We're just like so achy for something that's familiar and for something that's comfortable.
Yeah, and on that note, Gidge, I mean, that's like, you and I are talking like, yes, everything's always changing. So true. But, and at different clips. So some things feel relatively permanent or the same. Some things are changing by the millisecond. And it's pretty dizzying if you're trying to, it can be if you're just following any one thread. I think one of the skills of this is this being able to sort of zoom in and zoom out, zoom into the particulars of anything that needs doing or any particular issue, and zoom out to kind of hold the full picture, the whole scope. I think that's an important piece of the dynamic.
And to not get stuck in one of those positions as if that's all that there is.
Yes.
Right. But it is often so overwhelming that it's hard when we're in the thick of like, okay, now my person, there's a question in the chat about communication, right? We're in the thick of this person can't communicate to me with me anymore in the way that we used to. And like when we're like this, it gets so myopic. It's the only thing that exists, right? And that's so overwhelming. Right. So it's like, how do we move from the perspectives of like, whoa, this really acute and permanent change, and then scan back into like, what's the totality, or what, more space of where that exists.
Yep. It also reminded me, Bridget, about the importance of naming with all this change. Another sort of pretense of our conversation here is that authenticity and honesty really, really matter in these dynamics. And so staying true to what's actually going on, while also being asked to intervene and sometimes affect or change what's going on. It's really tricky. Sometimes there's an activism that it is primed, and sometimes there's an acceptance, and generally both. So it might sound like sometimes that we're going to be contradicting ourselves, or you're living in some paradox with all this stuff, and that may be. But I also think it's another way of just saying all these things are happening at the same time. They're all going on. It sort of depends, among other things, kind of where you place your focus, where you place your attention. And I think that's where, at least in one of the places where some dexterity in your lens really can help. I think one of the conceits there is, is to not confuse whatever our view is in that moment, whatever our frame is, focused or expanded, that don't confuse that with the totality of reality. Like that's a piece of the puzzle. So I think that's where we can get hung up sometimes, where you focus where you're comfortable, where you feel competent, and then these other things are going on, and it can feel, if you don't concede that early, you will be whipped around more than you need to be. So yeah,
it's making me like, this may feel tangenty, but I guess what that's bringing to my mind is like trying to create more space. Like there can feel like so much sadness in this, so much sadness and so much grief. And like, if you're a person like me who tends to be maybe a little bit more comfortable on that side of things, it can be really hard to remember the beauty and the joy and the light and the humor, right? And can we just remind ourselves that, like Rachel asked this question, could you say something about dealing with the lack of ability to communicate with a loved one once they can no longer clearly communicate, about the sadness and loss that comes with that, especially if there's so much left unsaid. Right. And it's like the point of being as connected to the sadness and loss as we can is to be able to come back onto the other side and to move across that spectrum of like, oh, the sadness and loss is here because of what was there that was big and bright and connected and communicative, or of what we wanted to be there that never was. So it's like, it's that same movement, like from the myopic to the big, from the sad to the joyful, and creating more spaces for it to coexist.
Right on. And to Rachel's question, this point of communication, I mean, relationship and communication sort of hand in glove. They practically seem one and the same in a way, because relationship implies a sort of exchange happening. It's relating, and to do that well, I think demands communication. But one answer to one response to your question, Rachel, is what passes as communication? Certainly verbal communication. I can tell you, Bridget, how I'm feeling. I can find the words, and you'll know because I told you.
Yeah.
Also, those words are something of a crutch. They're only ever a signpost or pointing to something that's there, whether you're saying it or not, often. So I think part of your question, Rachel, gets at with all this going on, how do you cue in how do you cue into what's happening for the other person? especially challenging if they can't or won't tell you. So one response would be, again, the nonverbal cues. There's a lot of going on outside of the word.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on the word. It gets a lot of attention, but there's a lot more going on. So nonverbal cues, watching the person's body, in some real ways, in some very sort of concrete ways. We know that folks who, like, for example, are very close to the end of life and not able to talk, the body, they're still alive, they're still in there, something going on, and the body will generally show us. It's hard, especially when we're disinhibited. It's hard to prevent, it's hard to hold back. So oftentimes again, I'm kind of taking a concrete or narrow view of your question, Rachel, but sometimes even if someone can't tell us they're in pain, for example, which is, as a caregiver, you're so concerned about, but they will grimace or fidget, or you, as the person who's connected, you may sense in your own body something going on. Your mirror neurons, if your empathy is really firing, you might just check yourself as a guide to maybe what's going on to the person who can't tell you.
Mm.
So these are some responses to the question.
Can I chime in on that?
Sure.
I read Rachel's question, I'm thinking to myself that the person that Rachel's caring for can no longer communicate, and there's sadness for Rachel wanting to pull out things that are unsaid. So how to maybe, yes, like responding to the person's physical body cues and how they might be feeling in that moment. But if there are things that Rachel feels are left unsaid, how to maybe come to terms with the fact that they may not be unsaid, or how to think about the things that Rachel wants to say, knowing that Rachel may not get a response.
Mm.
Wondering if that's part of it too.
Yeah. I mean, so often there's so many things unsaid, right? Like whether they're acute, they're lifelong things that needed to be talked about, or acute details like, this is what happened when I picked the kids up from school today. There's things unsaid. And I think we hold as I think this is what you're saying too, BJ, like we hold as the holy grail of communication a back and forth, but there's still so much power in the saying of the things that you want to say, whether they can hear you, whether they can respond, whether they're alive, whether they're dead, right? That there's still power in the intent of telling the person what you want to tell them. And I think next to that, there's extraordinary power in telling someone else. And having someone else act as a surrogate for that person, not because they can channel the thing that the person would actually say back to you, but I think this is where we can play with our imagination, our projection, sort of the existence between dimensions of like, there are so many opportunities to communicate even when the person can't give you words back.
Right on.
Yeah.
Right on. And that power of actually, yes, you may need to be heard, but very often you need to say it.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, because also very often we say the things we want to say to the person, they can respond, and they give us a response where we're like, well, really wish I hadn't said that. Like, turns out you're the same dad I've had my whole life. Turns out. Okay, I wish I had said that to BJ instead. I probably would have gotten a more validating response, or whoever. Sorry, Dad, if you're watching, not really talking about you, but
that reminds me, sorry if I'm interrupting you, Bridget.
No, you're good. You're good.
As you were pointing earlier a moment ago, like there's always so much left unsaid. I think also being careful how you frame what's happening. I think death, often we use language of tragedy around illness and death. And, I'm not gonna, if that's the way it's feeling, I'm great. Okay. For me anyway, it can be very helpful to remind myself things like, closure is sort of isn't a made up thing. Life is always kind of continuing in some regard. Everything is unfinished on some level. you
Mhm.
can get to these states. I don't mean to I mean, there is a feeling of completeness, and I don't want to blow past
Yeah.
that too. And it is so common, even if you think you've said everything, and then no longer for the person's gone or for whatever reason, months later you think of, well, why didn't I say this or ask that? So I just want to dim the blaring lights of tragedy as an overlay. And as though if we had only said this or asked this, then everything would have been okay. And I guess sometimes mathematically that's true, but boy, most often that's not. It's
Mhm. Mhm.
just
Yeah.
another point of how you frame these
Yeah.
moments.
Yeah. I'm just wondering because I actually don't know that I've had this experience, but I've certainly heard people report the experience of like some total peace, like they said everything they needed to say to their person, which is so amazing to contemplate. And also I'm like, makes me wonder about the nature of their relationship over time. Like, did they kind of always say all the things that they needed to say? And so the culminating feeling is I said all the things I needed to say because the culture of and the nature of our relationship was that that's what we were doing all of the time.
Mhm.
Right. That maybe that's not like a moment that happens because you have the conversation at the right time, but because that's what was happening over time was a fullness in that expression and in the seeing and being
Yeah,
seen.
yeah. And with that, with all that is happening, and I'm extrapolating from your question, Rachel, too. We're kind of riffing on it too, but um, I think one of the things that's so common in the caregiving dynamic in the relationship is a sense of it, because something is going wrong, because a person's getting sicker or whatever, a complication happens, those feel like something went off the path. But very often that is exactly the path. And if you're not careful about this sort of frame of zooming out to see the sort of incompleteness of everything, etc., then you run the risk of blaming yourself or getting down on yourself for what ultimately amounts to be an impossibility. There's always so much more going on than we can ever tend to per se or directly. So again, I just want to be careful of this framing because it will affect how you live on and how you feel about what's happened. And feeling like the feelings of failure seem just they just knock at the door so loudly. It seems so tempting when the frame of serious illness is things are going to get worse. So anyway, I'm going
Yeah.
off on another tangent here, but
Yeah.
Can I
Yes.
yes. We have a question or a kind of a comment from someone that really, I think, speaks to one of the slides on like spaciousness and closeness. So I'm wondering if I can read this and then we can maybe go into that. So Karen said, I specifically am having difficulty with decisions and how I claim a deep changing accountability to my inner nature while respecting my loved ones, including friends. And increasingly, it feels like every decision, some major, are driven by fear of changes in relationships. Just when I am so vulnerable due to illness and let's face it, aging, I am craving authenticity more than ever, and it feels like relationships are at risk. I just want to relax and love.
we'll look for that slide.
Mhm.
Yeah.
This feels familiar to me, Karen.
Hey, Sones.
Yes.
Can you reread Karen's good point, please?
Mhm.
Yes. Yes. I specifically am having difficulty with decisions across all areas in my life in how I claim a deep changing accountability to my inner nature while also respecting loved ones and friends. It increasingly feels like every decision is driven by fear of change in relationships just when I am vulnerable due to illness. I am craving authenticity. I wish to relax and just love.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. Karen, you always love hearing from you. As this slide, I mean, just one thought here is that comes up often enough is sort of this set, I think, as sort of an assumption that if we really love someone or care, but that we should always want to be with them, and that should always, and so especially as perhaps as time is getting shorter and shorter, it can be jolting to find yourself wanting time apart from the
Mm.
people you love. Again, whether patient or caregiver, and that ends up bumping into things like abandonment and running away, all sorts of other things. And so sometimes we find ourselves kind of just trying to inauthentically just stay proximate on either side. I've watched so many patients, clients over the years, when time is super short, spending so much of their time tending to the presentation to others, tending to the feelings of others. It's lovely, beautiful impulse. But then what ends up happening, you end up in an inauthentic place, which just seems like such a
Mm.
with small amount of time that starts taking on feeling of, I don't know, something illegal or sinful or something really problematic. And I guess one thought here, Karen, is just, the truth of what illness and death present to us is often not easily found in daily life. And as a patient, you may be sitting there much closer to big truths than anyone around you. And sometimes that big truth is, as the body winds down, physical proximity to others becomes less important. It seems to me that often as the body is shutting down, this sense of decline from a physical point of view, what's actually happening there can be the sort of rejiggering with something more like soul or spirit or vibe or whatever we want to call it. This thing that emanates from us, through us. And part of that crescendo of spirit might mean that you're not spending time, talking to friends on the phone or whatever else. And
Yeah.
I know the fear that can send to people who love you and around you, like, oh, where is she? I can't get to her. Or that can feel like a problem. I guess I'm just saying is what I feel I hear you calling for is that spaciousness, which may mean not being with others, not talking to others. And that is the most loving thing the truest thing you might be doing.
Mhm.
And anyway, I don't know if that helps. Um,
I just
uh,
I think so many things are coming to my mind as you're talking. I'm kind of like rereading Karen's
hmm,
words a lot because there's so much in here. Is it strikes me that you might be the first person in your sphere or in your lineage to do this in this way, and that means you're modeling so much and you're inviting people to be with themselves differently. You're giving permission for that. And you may not be here to see them heed that.
mhm,
But I think that kind of goes back to this like kind of interdimensional slash the importance of our imaginative space, which is like when it feels scary, going to that place of love and authenticity that you want to be in and sending it out,
mhm,
right? Taking it for yourself and then sending it out and trusting that people may not understand now. They may not understand in words. And sometime in the future, they'll
mm,
remember something about the way that you were. And that will be an invitation for them to move more closely to a way that they want to be. I
mm,
think the other thing that this just like keeps really begging, like pulling at for me, which is like such a huge question, deeply philosophical and spiritual, which is like, what is the point of relationship? Why do we have relationships? And that answer is probably beautifully different for each of us, but it's an important thing to like remind ourselves of. Like, why do we care?
mm,
For me, I think like, relationship, I mean, I'm sure I'm going to miss things and I'll look back on this and feel like I said it all wrong, but Like the point is to be known and to know. And ultimately, I feel like the deepest part of that is myself. For me to know myself. And I get to know myself in new and different ways through experiencing other people and getting to know them and deep curiosity about their life and integrating how they see me. But ultimately, it kind of comes back to like a me and me.
Mm.
That's not everybody's take, and it doesn't need to be yours. But I think that for me, that's buoying when I'm worried that someone's upset with me, when I'm worried that I've made a choice that I know is right for me, that's going to interrupt someone's sense of how the world is supposed to be. That's the place I've got to stick. Like, this is the thing I have the most influence over.
Yeah. Bridget, I just cut you off. Sorry.
No.
There's a lot in here. I think you're reminding me too of this sort of take a developmental arc, especially if you've been a really, connected person, spent a lot of time on thinking about others and the needs of others, etc.
Yeah.
And sometimes one of the other conceits, especially in the frame of palliative care, that comfort is really the goal. Or something ease is the goal. I think one way or another, we've talked about this in webinars, is that no, that's a pretty paltry goal. At some moments, that's an amazing, wonderful goal. When you're racked in agony, yes, give me some comfort. But in terms of a life lived, that means getting to all sorts of other pieces of the puzzle. The fullness of life includes disappointing others. Karen, I know of a friend of yours that I get to talk to from time to time, and she and I talk about this for both of our sakes, caregiver, care receivers. Like it really feels like for both of us that developmentally, the next great station for us is to learn how to disappoint another person, actually cause some heartache. And that may sound many different ways, but I just want to name that because that kind of comes up here. If you agree that the fullness of life, the fullness of experience is something of the goal, then a full life includes hard stuff, disappointments, etc. So in some ways, back to Bridget's point of you modeling, you being the teacher, I think that's a big one. And what's such a beautiful thought is to highlight something you said, Bridge, which is very often, time's such a funny thing. So very often you taking that sort of lead, Aaron, people who love you and, around you who aren't yet in shoes quite like yours, but someday will be,
Yeah.
What a beautiful thought that maybe long after we're gone, some of these hooks that we've set that felt confusing to others or problematic come around 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And that's when that person says, oh, that's what Karen was doing.
I get it.
Karen, and now I understand. And so there's also just to note this wild timeline here. Some of these hooks are set now, but not realized forever. And I think that's a lovely reminder and a sort of a nod towards having some faith that in the great expanse of life, these intentions, as you were saying, Bridge, land somewhere. Just make it take a while to read the cue.
Yeah,
Well,
what do we do to ourselves with this expectation around comfort, whether it's like in our dying, in our changing bodies, in our relationships? Like, so we have one hand, we think comfort is the outcome if we're doing it right, or it's done right to us. But in all these other transitions in our lives, we don't expect comfort. We don't start new jobs expecting comfort. We don't have children expecting comfort. Some of us don't get married expecting comfort. Like, we do it because we're excited and because it feels right. And because we've got probably an appropriate amount of angst and nervousness and clarity that this is the next step we're going to take. But the expectation of comfort or that peace and ultimate and totally clear connection means it's good or right. It's so limiting. It's not reflective of other big transitions in our lives.
and inauthentic in the big picture is that I hear Karen craving. Yeah. Hmm. Oh gosh. Okay. Well, any other comment zones in the chat or anywhere else, or should we keep on? We can head back to some of the content.
I love that this is turning into like relationship to part one, take two of where we just cover stuff and don't do slides. Okay. Claire had a comment. I'm thinking about what you're saying about disappointment and also my current situation of palliative care for a 96-year-old relative on end stage congestive heart failure, and being honest with him about why he is so tired and sleepy and that he's not going to rebound at this age. It's disappointing to be honest about where he's at in end stage heart failure, but it also feels necessary and honest and disappointing for him to know where he is in this disease.
Well, Bridge, were you about to say? I can jump in too.
Jump.
Well, your comment, Claire, is making me think of another sort of layer of the sort of three dimensions, four dimensions of sort of caregiving, especially care. You know, if I take your question, I'm presuming you're a caregiver in this role, perhaps a professional one. And
Yes,
one,
correct.
yeah, okay. So one of the jobs being the professional or something like that, but never mind professionalism, but in terms of, well, sort of actually importantly, professionalism, maybe an importantly slightly different dynamic than just two human beings, because there's some expectation that you are acting on behalf of the other person, not just simply entering an authentic dynamic.
Okay,
Um,
quick
Yeah.
addition. Sorry to jump in on this. So this person is family and lives with Claire, and Claire is a professional. So both the things are true.
Gotcha. Wow. Okay. Okay. And still holds what I think what I'm about to say still holds. Claire, you tell us. But just simply that part of the exquisiteness and why these relational dynamics cannot be boilerplate. You know, there cannot, this relational stuff cannot be put into a flow chart like so much of healthcare wants to be. And so part of the kindness from you sometimes telling someone the truth. Um, it's I think honesty is always a good thing, but how you dole it out when you choose to tell him. If right now that's sort of what you might call denial or unawareness or something like that, is it serving him? You know, is it helping him get through the day?
Mhm.
Or is it pulling him to make decisions that are actually bad for him? And you can see that. Is it pulling him farther away from himself on some level? In other words, is it hard for you, Claire, to hold this sort of disjointed truth? Or is it really wearing on him?
Yeah.
And if it's really your frustration, that's worth noting. And it may be something for you to tend to, not necessarily with him.
Mm.
If you see that this unawareness is causing suffering, or even more so, if he starts saying, gosh, why is this happening? I worry that it's my disease. Or if he just cracks the window a little bit and shows some awareness or readiness or wanting to know, that may be the moment to say, here's what I think's happening. You know, so anyway, I'm kind of trying to get at there's a time and a place to say things.
Yeah.
Just always say what's true, you know, something like that.
And I mean, so many things can be true.
Hmm.
And how many times does someone need the details of their disease, right? It's like, I'm so tired today. Why am I so tired?
Hmm.
And the place of honest connection in that moment might be like, God, yeah, it's such a bummer to be tired. I know you spent your whole life having so much energy. You were bouncing off the walls. You were always that person that got all the things done. Being tired is so different, right? Like he either knows in there that it's because of the heart failure or he knows it but doesn't want to know. Like,
Yeah. And you can tiptoe up to it. You can say things like, I don't know, you know, I got some ideas. You know, if you ever want to talk, I can put on
yeah,
my medical hat and if you ever want to sort of hypothesize about what's going on in there, I'm happy to talk about that with you, or share my opinion or something like that. You can,
Yeah.
without before saying the thing, you can open up the idea of saying the thing and see what they say.
Mhm. I think a lot of times, and this is what you're saying in the Claire chat, I think, or in the chat, Claire, I think a lot of times people know. They have some, they either know the facts or they know, right? They may not show us that. They may not report it to us in the way that makes us feel totally confident about that, but they're the ones in their body.
Mhm.
They've heard the words. They're in there somewhere. And if it's a repeat thing that comes up, it's like, what are all the different tracks we can go down? Like, yeah, you're tired again. Does that make you mad?
Mhm.
Like, do you feel sad about that? Like, what do you feel about being tired all the time? When I feel tired all the time, it feels like this. And sometimes I think we're hesitant to offer our own experience in that because we're like, well, I'm not 96. I don't have heart failure. It seems like an insult or inappropriate for me to throw my own experience of tiredness out there. And in some instances, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't land. And in others, then the person is like, well, I'm not the only one feeling tired. Okay, that feels kind of nice. Oh, right. On the one hand, I'm 96, I have end stage heart failure, and so I'm tired, and that just feels pretty like doomsday. But for this one moment, we could just both be tired people. We could both be people that feel really frustrated when they can't do the things that they want to do.
Mhm.
That's a
Yeah.
nice point of relational connection.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful bridge. I think also maybe you're thinking, make me think too, some of those moments where, Claire, with your line of sight, you know, sometimes sort of noting when, even if it means kind of bl- blowing past a little resistance, another example that where this starts having lots of consequence besides just how the felt experience, but like if you're hearing him say things like, well, I don't want to. Before I die, I really want to do X, Y, and Z. But I'm so tired now. I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait till I get my strength back, and then I'll do X, Y, or Z. That thing that I gotta do before I die. Sometimes it's not so clear, but sometimes it is. And if
Mhm.
you hear that, that may be a moment to say, because knowing as you do that heart failure ain't gonna get better, and the fatigue is generally only going to worsen unless there's an exacerbated sort of acute moment. But that may be a moment where you say, "Gosh." Oh, I hear that. And this is where I'm afraid that there's a problem with that plan and something like that. And maybe a moment to sort of intervene and push the conversation beyond what's just a reaction to how he's doing, to what he's saying.
Mhm.
So there's nuance in here.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I appreciate, Claire, just your mentioning that, like, you're witnessing him make sense of what's happening in his body and his life, and it makes you sad.
Mhm.
And this may sound like, well, it's going to sound like whatever it sounds like.
Mhm.
Why does it make you sad? Right. And that's just a provocative question because it's going to bring up the fullness. It makes me sad because I remember him as this vital person. It makes me sad because I don't want him to die. It makes me sad because it's scary to think about how our bodies change, right? But it's again moving from this perspective of like, this makes me sad, to what's the bigger context of, oh, this person was so robust. I feel sad because I think he's probably sad, right? But just pulling out the different threads because there's probably something nourishing
Mhm.
in there.
Mhm.
Some buoy of like, I'm sad because I love him so much. Oh, can you let yourself feel the love, right? To complement the sad, can you feel the love?
That at its root.
Yeah, that is the reason you feel sad, is because of the love, because of the connection, because of your attachment to him.
Yeah. Amen. Sadness is not the problem. Often is not a problem, but reflects this deep love.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah, like
sometimes we need a real invitation, a real reminder to come up out of the sad and back into the love.
yeah.
Yeah.
We've got like 12 more minutes. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if, yeah, it went fast.
Okay.
I'm wondering if you two want to go into compassion, which I think is also like compassion for yourself versus the other person, which also fits, I think, to what Claire is talking about. But also, please, anyone raise your hand or put in a
Yeah.
Q&A question because
Yeah.
this
If
is
anybody wants to talk in their voice
yeah.
with us today.
This has been really lovely. No hands so far, so we'll get them if they do.
Yeah.
Well, Bridge, this one's a biggie.
Mm. Mhm.
You know, at the root of this sort of this text here is, that relationships are all over the place, including your relationship to yourself. And it is such a common trap in the caregiving world to assume that, well, this person is the one who's dying or sick, so this is the person who gets the compassion. And
Mhm.
what ends up being has become sort of part of a kind of a caregiving or certainly a medical culture is this notion that I'm a caregiver. I don't need anything. My patient or my loved one, they're the ones in need. So this love or kindness often gets expressed ultimately as um, a force that pulls you farther away from yourself.
Mm.
Ends up being often a very sacrificial approach to care. And that'd be one thing, you might even find your way to defending that approach, for one reason or another. But I think in general that sort of one unidirectional kind of care, unidirectional compassion, very often ultimately can result in a sort of a flattening of the experience where you are not available in some real ways. And so if you're trying to be the best caregiver, the greatest caregiver ever or something like that, it's especially incumbent on you to love yourself in that hard mix,
Mhm.
not the opposite. Um, just to key us up a little bit in terms of what a lot of us inherit is the right way to care. What about you, Bridge? What's coming up for you on this?
Um, it kind of feels hard to articulate, but I guess I'm seeing again, I'm like, my mind is just working on these spectrums today, but it's like compassion for others over here and compassion for ourselves is over here. And we can kind of just we get really in these tracks of our brain of going one directional, and kind of like the whole theme of today is that this is a bi-directional back and forth situation. And when we feel that sadness for someone else, can it be an invitation to also check in or be with what we feel or have as much interest in our own experience? And that's a hard ask when every minute of your day is consumed in, or can feel consumed in, the management of what's happening. But I guess the other kind of idea that I like under compassion, or something that makes compassion feel kind of like operationalized to me, is benefit of the doubt.
Mm.
Can we assume benefit of the doubt for another and for ourselves? Like, with everything that's going on, everyone is doing the best that they can. Can we have some awe about that? Can we access some grace if we really let ourselves believe that, even when everything is like a mess and the other person is so disappointing and we feel so disappointing and like, oh my God, I know he can't hear. Why am I so frustrated and screaming at him? Right? But it's like, oh, because this is hard and he's doing the best that he can and I'm doing the best that I can. And is there a way to be in the softness of that?
Right on. Well, maybe I think we both sort of made a case for self-compassion.
Mm.
I mean, I think I'm focusing on the self-compassion because that seems like the harder
Mm,
of the two. But to your point, it's not really two. They're all deeply entwined. So it's sort of a false distinction to begin with.
mhm,
But nonetheless, uh, how, let's just think here, are there how to operationalize, to use your word, this compassion? Sometimes that compassion may mean disappointing someone.
mm,
You can loving, sometimes that may be lovingly losing your shit, to keep it real. Um, so, but how else can we evoke that actual, how else, like, I know it's important to have compassion for myself, but how the hell do you do that
mhm,
with the critical mind going on in the background? I mean, one answer is something very simple as you do with others, sometimes where there's no words for it, putting your hand on a person's arm. I mean, I
mm,
just did this, like this gesture can help.
mhm.
There are some primal basics. Other things, Bridge, anything for you? Is there any way that we can, other ways to kind of
Yeah.
make it
I mean, I
so?
think part of it is, right, it requires some investigation or some self-knowing of what we what our edginess looks like,
Mm,
right? So for me, if I'm like really on a tear
mm,
judging myself, judging another, deciding what is like absolutely right or wrong, like I'm just on one. Um, if I can catch myself, I can kind of like wake up into that and catch myself in that. It's usually an invitation to be in connection with something that's like soft and vulnerable that needs some love and tending. My judgment is like a great protector of mine. It's one of my favorites, right? But what are your protectors? Like, what are the things that you do when, like, you know, what when there's actually something in there that's softer and more tender that needs some attention? And can we, instead of like, oh my God, I'm such an asshole, I've just been like judging my husband for 8 years,
mm,
can we come back to like, oh, right, I'm not doing that because I have malice. I'm doing that because I feel threatened in some way.
mm,
Right. But we all have different, we have to sort of like get to know those maps of ourselves, which is like, what are the protective things we do? And can we use those protective behaviors as an invitation to go to a softer place and be like, oh yeah, like I'm really scared. I'm
mm,
really scared that I'm doing this wrong.
mm,
I'm really scared I'm not going to know how to do it without you.
mm,
It's hard, even just saying those words, like in a hypothetical situation, it's hard to not have softness. It's hard to not, get in touch with emotion.
mm, mm,
So what are the things that each of us do? How do we know, oh, I'm working hard to protect myself right now,
mm, mm,
in the right time, in the right place, in my car when I'm by myself and the heat's on and the doors are locked and the music's playing, right? I can take a moment to be like curious about what I felt the need to defend and protect so hard all day.
We did have sorry to
No, you're good.
this beautiful thought with a question. Um, and I know, Bridge, you've got to head out at a hard stop. So Shayna said, since becoming chronically ill, my relationships have completely changed. There were activities before, and now it's mostly infrequent phone calls or visits. It's a hard adjustment for myself and others. It's not really a question, but if you could talk about this, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so much adjustment. It's adjusting and adapting, adjusting, adapting, adjusting, and adapting. And sometimes we can feel so tired and so busied by all the ways in which we're figuring out new ways of being that it really feels like we get to miss the being part.
mm. I need to ask you to reread that. I'm sorry.
No problem. Since becoming chronically ill, my relationships have completely changed. There were activities before, and now it's mostly infrequent phone calls or visits. it's a hard adjustment for myself and others. Not really a question, but if you could talk about this, that would be great. So changes in relationships when one person's body changes and they're no longer able to do the activities that they might have done with the people in their lives, like that, just speaking to that change and navigating that change.
Well, from some rudiments come up when I hear that point, and it's a big one. Can be devastating. It can be so,
Yeah.
you know, a phrase we've said around here many times, one way or another, like, yeah, illness or disability, these things are hard, but what's really hard is other people in some way, like what they do or don't do around us, and you can feel like,
They can tolerate.
yeah. And as Karen pointed out earlier, you know, sadly or weirdly or finely, very often the person who's hurting, the person living with chronic illness, you, Shayna, for all that you're going through, then on top of it, you might find yourself cast as the teacher, as the role model, when like you're just trying to get to the bathroom or back or something very basic, and you're the one ostensibly losing, and just to name that is a real thing. So some of that is some of the work maybe you're pointing to is we as a culture, we as a society need to continue to find a way to paint a bigger reality that includes all of us, that includes all that we go through, like illness and death. So part of a response is to think of this sort of systems or macro level. But back to you, I mean, I just simply say is to get that self-compassion, and you finding your way to getting your feet underneath you on some level, that this isn't you doing it wrong. This is the nature of illness. So to find a way to be your own ally in this mix. And then it might be simply, very concrete communication. Hey, friend X, here's what I need,
Yeah. I think so often we haven't done that, right? Like the things have just evolved in the busyness and the fullness and in the way that time passes. And, it's really vulnerable. But I think a call to a person that feels like a person you would be willing to take the risk to make the call to say like, hey, I miss you and my life has changed and this is the capacity that I have. And I'd really love if you came and sat with me.
Yeah.
This is what I can do. Right. But we often don't make the direct asks. And then we feel really sad when people don't show up into the spaces, but they don't know how. And they feel scared and they have their own worry about making you feel worse or their own discomfort. And sometimes it's on us to step into the really vulnerable space of acknowledging this has changed so much. And I miss you and I really want to be connected. And here's a way that can happen.
Right on. Beautiful. And I know we're at time, and Bridge, you in particular got to go today. And thanks everybody. And one last thought for you, Shanna, is in my own experience too, this is where don't take your foot off the pedal with humans, but sometimes the limitations between humans can really summon the joys of connecting to animals or trees or inanimate objects or the rest of the living world. So it's maybe an odd point to end on, but that has been a real salve for me and others. So all right, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you too. And thanks everyone for all your wonderful questions and comments that made it extra special and different. Thank you so much. Happy weekend, everyone.
Sonia, thanks, BJ.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.